Imagine standing in the middle of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1920. The streets are dusty, the air thick with oil smoke, and the world is buzzing with the hum of horse-drawn carts and the first rattling automobiles. Now imagine you're 55 years old. 55. Half a century of dreams, deals, wins, and losses etched into the lines of your face. Most men your age are content, settling into the quiet of respectability. But not you, not William Grove Skelly. That was his life. The man who transformed oil fortunes into a gateway to the skies. He was already a legend in the oil industry, a titan who had built the Skelly Oil Company from scratch, often risking his entire fortune on wild ventures. Yet by 1920, the world was changing faster than any pipeline he'd ever drilled. Automobiles had begun to dominate roads. Airplanes were no longer curiosities. They were screaming symbols of the future. Skelly could have rested on his laurels. He had wealth, influence, and a reputation as one of Oklahoma's most cunning businessmen. But there's something about ambition that refuses to age gracefully. Something in his eyes burned like kerosene when others saw fire extinguished. He saw opportunity where others saw chaos. And in his mind, oil, the black gold that had made him, was not the end. It was the fuel for something higher, faster, impossible. Picture him in his office late one night. The city lights glint off the glass, a half-empty whiskey glass beside blueprints of an airplane he barely understands. The smell of crude oil from his refinery drifts faintly through the room. He leans back, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this is madness. He's 55. Most people at his age don't start over. Most people fear failure more than they crave triumph. But Skelly? He's already lived risk like a heartbeat. He doesn't flinch. And here's the question that haunts anyone daring, enough to dream at his age. Would you have turned away from comfort, security, and reputation to chase something the world hasn't even dared to believe possible? Could you take the black gold that built your empire and gamble it on wings, engines, and a future that seems too vast to touch? Skelly didn't just ask that question, he lived it. And what happened next would shock the very notion of age, risk, and vision. Long before airplanes entered his mind, William Skelly was no stranger to struggle. Born in 1878 in Ontario, Canada, he arrived in the United States with little more than ambition in his pockets and fire in his chest. Tulsa was not yet the oil capital it would become. It was a rough, raw town of dirt streets and hopes bigger than most could afford. Skelly started at the bottom, selling barrels, negotiating deals, learning the pulse of an industry that could either make you immortal or bury you under a mountain of crude and failure. By his 20s, he was already maneuvering through the treacherous oil fields of Oklahoma. But the first taste of real success didn't come easy. There were rigs that collapsed, wells that dried up overnight, and rivals who would have happily crushed him if he showed the slightest weakness. Every deal was a gamble. Every misstep could have left him penniless, forgotten, buried in the dust he was constantly trying to rise above. Yet Skelly had something many men lacked, a relentless appetite for vision. He didn't just see oil, he saw what oil could become. He saw power, influence, the ability to shape industries, communities, lives. And as he climbed, he wasn't immune to fear. There were nights he sat alone in his small office, staring at a ledger, wondering if every risk he took had been worth it. Family responsibilities, employees counting on him, investors watching every move. He carried it all on his shoulders like Atlas with a barrel of crude strapped to his back. But something was shifting in the world. Automobiles had started to roar. Factories churned day and night, and the skies began to whisper promises that were impossible to ignore. The idea of flying, once a dream for inventors and daredevils, started feeling inevitable. Skelly noticed young pilots, jittery yet fearless, taking fragile machines into the air. He watched planes rise from dusty fields, small shadows that hinted at a future he couldn't yet reach with pipelines or refineries. For a moment he questioned himself. Was it madness to consider aviation? Could a man who had mastered oil really pivot to something so foreign, so untested, so risky? But then he remembered the smell of crude that had once seemed overwhelming, the thrill of the first successful well, the first time a rival underestimated him and lost. Every failure had taught him one thing: comfort is the enemy of progress. And in that restless night, Staring at Tulsa's dim lights, Skelly realized the truth he would carry for the rest of his life. The world favors the bold, the daring, the ones willing to chase impossibility. And just like that, the seeds of a new obsession took root. Not in oil this time, in air. The thrill, the danger, the potential. It was intoxicating. But the question lingered, almost taunting him. Could he really trade the empire he had built for a dream the world barely understood? Could a man of 55 gamble everything again? By the early 1920s, William Skelly's mind was no longer confined to the oil fields and refinery floors. He was restless in a way that money alone could never satisfy. Tulsa was buzzing with the promise of airplanes, machines that could lift men into the sky, defy gravity, and redefine the limits of human ambition. Most of Skelly's peers scoffed at the idea. Leave airplanes to dreamers and daredevils, they said. But Skelly? He heard opportunity where others heard nonsense. It began quietly. He attended air shows, observing the jerky movements of fragile biplanes, watching pilots' white-knuckled grips on rudimentary controls. The roar of engines, the smell of oil and burning fuel. It reminded him of his first oil rig, chaotic yet alive. And yet, he felt something different this time. He wasn't just watching, he was imagining. What if airplanes weren't just toys for thrill seekers, but a future where oil could power the skies? What if his empire could leap from land to air, and he could be at the forefront of an industry no one truly understood yet? Skelly began experimenting in small ways. He invested cautiously at first, funding pilot schools and flying clubs, sponsoring exhibitions that were as much about testing the machines as they were about proving to the world, and to himself, that this was real. Every penny he spent carried weight. Each failure stung more than a dry well. Crashes happened. Engines failed. Skelly watched pilots tumble from the sky, his stomach knotting as he realized the cost of progress was measured in human courage, and sometimes human lives. Still, he persisted. It wasn't just about business. It was about belief. He believed in the impossible because he had spent a lifetime defying what others thought was safe, practical, or reasonable. And yet the psychological strain was enormous. 55 is an age where most men cling to certainty, not see, haze uncertainty. Skelly faced whispered doubts in boardrooms, worried glances from family, even moments of internal fear where he questioned whether ambition had finally overreached. Then came the small breakthroughs, the first planes funded by his money that stayed airborne for more than a few minutes, the young pilots whose skills seemed almost superhuman. Skelly watched them rise into the sky, his eyes glinting with a mixture of pride and longing. Each ascent was a whisper of promise, a reminder that the world still had uncharted territories, and that he, too, could still chart them. And yet the stakes were rising. His investments were bleeding him financially, and critics whispered that a man of his age should retire gracefully, leave the thrills to the younger generation. But every time Skelly heard that, it felt like a challenge thrown directly at his chest. Do you have the courage to see this through? And he did, because for William Skelly, quitting had never been an option. The real question now loomed larger than ever. Could he transform not just aviation, but the way the world connected to his oil empire? Could he take the wealth and influence he had spent decades building and launch it into the unknown skies? The answer would require a risk so bold it could either cement his legend or destroy everything he had worked for. By the mid-1920s, William Skelly's fascination with aviation had transformed into obsession. But obsession carried a price. Every venture, every investment, every fledgling airplane that skidded, stalled, or crashed reminded him that the sky was a harsh, unforgiving mistress. Unlike oil, which could be drilled, refined, and sold with a measured risk, aviation demanded perfection, courage, and a tolerance for chaos few men possessed. Skelly was learning this the hard way. He poured millions into Tulsa's fledgling aviation industry. Small companies sprouted, each a fragile attempt to master flight. Engines coughed and sputtered, plans failed. Skilled pilots were injured, and the press often painted these failures as folly. Friends and competitors whispered behind closed doors, questioning whether the titan of oil had finally lost his touch. Was he chasing dreams too lofty for a man nearing 60? The emotional weight of these whispers pressed on him like the heavy barrels of crude he had once hauled himself. But what struck him hardest wasn't the financial toll, it was the personal cost. Skelly felt the sting of doubt from within. Nights alone in his office became battlegrounds of the mind. Shadows of past successes haunted him. The empire he had built from the ground up, the wells, the refineries, the pipelines that had made him wealthy beyond imagination, seemed almost trivial compared to this new, untamed challenge. And yet something deep inside refused to relent. He remembered his early days, scraping together pennies for drilling leases, sleeping in drafty offices, enduring humiliation after failure. And suddenly, the risk didn't seem quite so terrifying. Skelly began to see failure not as defeat, but as a crucible. Each collapsed engine, each botched flight, each disappointed investor sharpened his resolve. He was learning to be patient with the sky as he had Liz, learned to be patient with the earth. Then came the turning points, small victories that felt monumental. A plane that stayed aloft for a full 10 minutes. A pilot who praised the reliability of an engine Skelly had funded. These victories didn't erase the stress or the fear, but they gave him glimpses of what was possible. Every failure was now a lesson, every success a spark of validation. The psychological toll was still immense, but the flame of vision burned brighter than ever. And yet, the defining question loomed over him. Could he, at 55, risk everything he had built in oil to bet on a dream so uncertain that the world still mocked it? Could a man of his age take the leap others wouldn't dare? The answer would demand more than vision. It would demand audacity, sacrifice, and a willingness to bet his legacy on a future that existed only in his mind's eye. It was 1926, and William Skelly was standing at the edge of everything he had built. 55 years of wealth, influence, and hard-earned respect, ready to be wagered on something the world still called impossible. Tulsa's streets below buzzed with commerce, but above, the sky called. The decision he faced was no longer about money or even ambition. It was about courage, the raw, unrelenting kind that separates men from legends. Skelly had watched planes crash, engines fail, and dreams disintegrate into smoke and splintered wood. Yet, in that very chaos, he saw the blueprint of a future that no one else could imagine. The oil that had made him rich wasn't just fuel for engines. It could be the lifeblood of aviation itself. He realized that with strategic investment, innovation, and sheer audacity, he could turn Tulsa into a hub for flight. But doing so would mean risking everything. One misstep could annihilate his fortune, his reputation, even his very sense of self. He called his closest advisors into the office, their eyes wide as he outlined his plan. It was audacious, reckless, and intoxicating. He would fund the creation of an aircraft manufacturing company. He would sponsor pilot schools, engine research, and the production of airplanes that could compete with the best in the world. Every cent of his oil fortune he funneled into this vision. Some advisors panicked. Others left the room silently, unwilling to follow him into what seemed like certain disaster. But Skelly's resolve didn't waver. There was a moment, late one night, when he sat alone in the glow of a single desk lamp. Blueprints of aircraft sprawled across the table, a half-empty glass of whiskey sweating in the heat of the Oklahoma summer. He could feel the weight of doubt pressing against his shoulders, the ghosts of every failed well and every skeptical voice whispering, "You're too old. He already won. Walk away." But he didn't, because Skelly understood a truth few men ever truly grasp. The only way to leave a legacy is to risk the things that comfort would never let you touch. And so he leaped. Tulsa Aircraft Corporation was born. Engines roared, metal wings took shape, and Skelly poured not just money but his identity into a venture that terrified even him. The tension was unbearable. Every crash, every miscalculation, every anxious night threatened to undo decades of empire building. But with each risk, he inched closer to something extraordinary, a transformation of his life and the world around him. The moment he watched the first Skelly-funded plane take flight, lifting gracefully above the Oklahoma horizon, something inside him broke and rebuilt itself simultaneously. The gamble wasn't just paying off, it was rewriting the rules of what a man of 55 could dare to achieve. And yet the real test was only beginning. Could he maintain control, scale the vision, and turn fleeting flights into a sustainable aviation empire? The months after that first flight were electric. Tulsa buzzed with the promise of aviation, and Skelly felt a thrill unlike anything oil had ever given him. But with every triumph came a wave of consequences, financial, emotional, and societal. Investors demanded results faster than airplanes could safely fly. Engineers pushed boundaries, sometimes too far. And Skelly, still 55, found himself pulled into the cockpit of responsibility like never before. He spent endless nights in workshops, pacing alongside mechanics, studying blueprints, learning engines as if they were extensions of his own body. The smell of oil mixed with metal and burning fuel became a familiar scent, one that reminded him of the rigs he had once mastered, now mirrored in turbines and wings. There were days when the stress pressed him nearly to breaking. A failed engine could mean bankruptcy. A pilot's mistake could haunt him for a lifetime. Yet every risk also brought a surge of exhilaration, a confirmation that he was alive, fully, intensely, against the predictable tide of comfort and age. Then came the first true breakthrough. The airplanes funded by Skelly were not just flying, they were reliable. Local airfields started buzzing with young pilots trained through his programs. Orders trickled in from neighboring states. The impossible was beginning to take shape in reality. Skelly walked through the hangars, watching wings glint in the sunlight, hearing the roar of engines echoing off the metal walls, and felt a profound sense of vindication. He had bet everything, and the sky was answering. Yet, he never let triumph dull his vigilance. The psychological weight of responsibility lingered. Each flight, each engine test, reminded him that one lapse could undo years of work. The thrill of innovation was inseparable from the fear of catastrophe. Skelly learned to embrace that fear, scaling it into precision, strategy, and leadership. He realized that risk wasn't something to escape, it was a companion to excellence. And slowly the world began to notice. Newspapers reported on Tulsa as a budding center for aviation, crediting a bold businessman with vision beyond oil. Pilots who once had nothing but ambition now had resources and infrastructure, and Skelly, despite his age, had become the bridge between traditional industry and the dawn of modern flight. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that true success demanded not just risk, but resilience, patience, and an unrelenting hunger for possibility. But even as the first victories mounted, the stakes were about to rise higher. Skelly's bold gamble had succeeded, but the horizon still held challenges no fortune, no experience, and no ambition could fully prepare him for. One miscalculation, one storm, one failed contract could erase everything, and the question lingered. Could a man of 55 keep pushing forward when the world was finally watching and expecting miracles? By 1928, William Skelly was no longer just an oil magnate dabbling in aviation. He had become the architect of a fledgling industry, a man who refused to let age or convention dictate the limits of ambition. Tulsa Aircraft Corporation had grown from a handful of planes to a small fleet, training pilots, producing engines, and innovating designs that hinted at a future where flight would become ordinary. But the journey was far from over. Every day demanded more than business acumen. It demanded emotional resilience. Skelly faced engineers who argued, pilots who questioned, bankers who hesitated, and competitors eager to exploit any misstep. He absorbed the stress like a sponge, translating doubt into decisions, fear into strategy. His mind, once occupied solely with oil pipelines and refineries, now ran on two simultaneous tracks, the grounded reality of industry and the limitless possibilities of the sky. It was exhausting, exhilarating, and transformative. He walked the hangars daily, a figure both commanding and contemplative. Watching young pilots strap into their planes, he felt a paternal pride mixed with a sharp edge of accountability. Every ascent was a test of the systems he funded and the vision he nurtured. When engines roared to life, he didn't just see machinery. He saw ambition made tangible, courage made visible. And with each flight, he internalized a profound truth. Mastery of the mind mattered more than mastery of money. His fortune had opened doors, but his mindset kept them open. Skelly's age, which others had treated as a liability, became an advantage. He had patience born from decades of risk, wisdom honed by failures, and emotional discipline that allowed him to weather storms, both literal and metaphorical. While younger men might panic at delays, crashes, or setbacks, Skelly learned to lean into them, extracting lessons and using adversity as fuel. The man who had once feared aviation's uncertainty now thrived within it. By the early 1930s, his aviation enterprises were gaining attention nationally. Air shows, pilot schools, and production lines bore the mark of a visionary who could connect oil to engines, ambition to infrastructure, and dreams to reality. Skelly had turned fear into action, uncertainty into opportunity, and age into an asset. What began as a gamble at 55 had matured into a testament to the power of persistence, imagination, and psychological fortitude. And yet, even as success solidified, the story remained a quiet challenge to anyone watching. How much are you willing to risk to turn your vision into reality? How deeply can you trust your instincts when every whisper of doubt tells you to stop? Skelly had answered these questions through action, proving that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to move forward despite it. As the sun set over Tulsa, William Skelly stood on the edge of a hangar, watching planes glide gracefully against the fiery sky. 55 years of life, struggle, risk, and ambition had led to this moment. The air smelled of oil, metal, and possibility, a scent that had fueled him for decades. He thought of every setback, every failure, every sleepless night, and realized that they had all been necessary. Without them, the planes would never have flown, and he would never have soared alongside them in spirit. Skelly's journey from oil tycoon to aviation pioneer wasn't just about money, machines, or ambition. It was about courage. It was about seeing potential where others saw danger, about trusting instincts when every voice in the world whispered stop, and about understanding that age is not a cage, but a lens through which wisdom sharpens opportunity. Every plane that lifted off the ground was a symbol not only of innovation, but of resilience, audacity, and the relentless refusal to settle. He had turned a fortune in black gold into a legacy in the skies. But more importantly, he had transformed himself. The man who had once hesitated to risk a single investment had learned to bet on ideas, people, and dreams with his entire heart. The fear that had once threatened to paralyze him had become a compass, guiding decisions instead of dictating them. Skelly understood that true success is never guaranteed. It is earned in moments of doubt, in choices that terrify, and in the stubborn refusal to let comfort dictate the terms of life. And now, as the planes disappeared into the twilight, he faced the most profound truth of all. Opportunity belongs to those who dare. It doesn't matter how old you are, how much you've accumulated, or how many failures have scarred your journey. What matters is whether you are willing to step into the unknown, risk everything, and rise despite the odds. If life tested you like it tested him, would you have kept fighting? Would you have trusted yourself enough to bet your legacy on the impossible? Look at your own dreams, your own fears, and ask, are you letting doubt ground you, or are you ready to take flight? William Skelly did. And because he did, the world learned that oil could power not only industry but imagination, ambition, and the boundless sky.